At a certain point, many people experience a peculiar kind of revulsion when they open social media. Not the mild irritation of seeing too many vacation photos or the fatigue of endless political arguments. Something deeper. They open the app, finger hovering over the camera icon. A thought half-formed about something they might share, and then a wave of something like nausea passes through them. Things that once felt natural, like posting a photo of their morning coffee or sharing a thought about a book they're reading, suddenly seem grotesque, impossible, like being asked to perform surgery on themselves in public. And naturally they become confused about this. They think perhaps they're depressed, or have become antisocial, or are suffering from some new form of anxiety. They watch others post freely, seemingly unburdened by this paralysis, and wonder what's wrong with them. They try to force themselves past it, tell themselves it's silly to feel this way about something so trivial, but the feeling only intensifies. The act of making themselves visible feels not just uncomfortable but somehow obscene, like a violation of something sacred they can't quite name. But what if I told you this revulsion isn't a symptom of something broken in you, but evidence of something that remains intact? You see, most of what we call social media presence is actually a kind of voluntary fragmentation. This is what Søren Kierkegaard was pointing to when he wrote about the despair of not being oneself. Though he died long before Instagram existed, he understood that the self is not a simple thing, not a fixed object that can be photographed and displayed. The self for Kierkegaard is a relation that relates to itself, a process of becoming that can only happen in the privacy of inwardness. When you try to make this process public, something strange happens. You're forced to choose a version of yourself to present, to freeze what is fluid into a pose, to translate what is wordless into caption. It's like trying to capture the taste of water by describing its chemical formula. The description is accurate, but completely misses what matters. And here's what almost no one tells you: the pattern that's invisible until you see it. Every act of self-presentation on social media requires you to become an object to yourself first. You must step outside yourself, view yourself as others might view you, curate and edit that image, and then offer it up for evaluation. This is what the mystics called self-consciousness in its most alienated form. Not simple awareness, but the splitting of awareness into watcher and watched, performer and audience, subject and object, all collapsed into a single tortured moment of clicking post. Think of it this way. Imagine you're a musician, and music flows through you when you sit alone with your instrument. Not performance, not practice, just the pure, strange joy of sound moving through your body into the world. Then imagine someone installs cameras and microphones in your room, connects them to a feed where thousands of people can tune in at any moment, and adds a comments section below. They tell you this is simply sharing your gift, and technically, yes, the music is still happening. Your fingers still move across the strings, but something essential has been murdered. The music is no longer emerging from that wordless place inside you. It's being generated by your awareness of being watched, shaped by your anticipation of reaction, haunted by your fear of judgment or your hunger for validation. The channel through which music once flowed has been clogged with self-consciousness. What comes out now might be technically proficient, might even win applause, but it's no longer music in the way that matters. It's performance. And performance, no matter how skilled, is always a form of absence, a substitution of the real with the represented. This is what's happening when you feel that visceral revulsion at the thought of posting. Some part of you recognizes that what you're being asked to do is not simply share an experience, but to murder it by making it an object. And this period of refusal, this withdrawal from visibility, can feel deeply isolating. You watch others seem to navigate this world effortlessly, crafting selves that appear coherent and confident and connected. You wonder if you're the only one who finds it impossible. The usual response is to try desperately to overcome this resistance, to see it as a weakness to be conquered. You tell yourself you're being precious, overthinking that everyone else manages to do this without falling apart, so why can't you? But this doesn't work, because the revulsion isn't a failure of courage or a lack of social skill. It's your integrity refusing to cooperate with your own objectification. Let me give you an analogy that might clarify what's actually happening. Imagine you've spent your whole life in a house with windows. You could look out at the world and occasionally people might glance in. but mostly you inhabited your rooms in privacy. The windows let in light, but also allowed for the possibility of drawing curtains of darkness, of spaces that were yours alone. Then one day someone comes and tells you they're going to replace all your walls with transparent ones. Floor-to-ceiling glass on every side. They assure you it's wonderful, that everyone is doing it, that this is what connection looks like now. And they're right, that the light is different. Everything is illuminated. There are no shadows, no corners, no rooms where you can be unseen. At first you try to adapt. You arrange yourself carefully, always aware that you might be observed from any direction. You start choosing your actions based not on what you want to do, but on how they might appear from outside. You become a curator of your own visibility. But here's what they didn't tell you. Humans need darkness to see clearly. Your eyes, which evolved to see in varying conditions, begin to malfunction in this relentless exposure. You develop a kind of blindness, not from lack of light, but from too much of it. And more than that, you lose access to certain experiences that can only happen in privacy. The thoughts that emerge in darkness, the faces you make when no one is watching, the versions of yourself that are too unformed, too strange, too raw to survive exposure to interpretation. Once you see this pattern, you understand that your refusal to participate isn't antisocial. It's an act of self-preservation. Now, you might think this sounds rather extreme, even melodramatic. What's the big deal about posting a photo or sharing a thought? Isn't this just making a mountain out of a molehill, turning something trivial into some grand existential crisis? And you're right to push back. It's not as if posting on social media causes immediate psychological collapse. People do it every day without apparent damage, but here's what I'm pointing to. The subtle accumulation of these small acts of self-objectification creates a kind of background static in your relationship with yourself. You begin to narrate your experiences even as you're having them, always with an awareness of how they might be translated into shareable form. You lose access to the texture of unmediated experience, the quality of life lived without the frame of potential documentation. And this loss is so gradual, so normalized, that most people don't even realize it's happening until they're standing in a beautiful place, feeling nothing except anxiety about whether they're capturing it correctly. The soul that refuses visibility isn't being precious or difficult. It's simply refusing to cooperate with its own diminishment. I once knew someone who had been very active on social media for years. Not an influencer exactly, but someone who posted regularly, thoughtfully, who had cultivated a presence that felt authentic and received genuine engagement. Then something shifted. Not dramatically, no crisis or scandal, just a growing discomfort that she couldn't quite articulate. She would draft posts and then delete them, start to share a photo and then feel a kind of vertigo, as if she were standing at the edge of something dangerous. She tried to power through it, told herself she was being ridiculous, but the feeling intensified until one day she simply stopped. Not as a political statement, not to prove anything, just because she couldn't do it anymore. And the period that followed was strange and difficult. She felt a kind of grief, because she had been visible in that way for so long that it had become part of how she understood herself. But she also felt something else, something that took months to identify. She was sitting in her garden one afternoon, not doing anything in particular, when she noticed that she was simply present there, not thinking about how to describe the light through the leaves, not framing the moment for future documentation, not narrating the experience of being in her garden. Just the light, the leaves, the warmth of sun on her skin, the sound of birds she couldn't name. And she realized this was the first time in years she had experienced anything without the overlay of potential translation into shareable form. That this way of being present, this unmediated contact with her own experience, was what she had lost without knowing she had lost it. Not because social media is evil or because she had used it wrong, but because visibility itself, constant potential visibility, changes the nature of experience in ways that are nearly impossible to undo once established. So what emerges when you stop trying to be seen? Not immediately, not as a reward for good behavior, but slowly, like sight returning after being in darkness. What emerges is a different kind of presence. Not the cultivated, curated presence of the carefully managed self, but something older and stranger. The self before it learned to perform itself. The self that exists prior to its representation. It's not more authentic in some simple sense. Authenticity has become such a tired word. Another thing to perform. It's more like, how can I say this? It's like the difference between a photograph of the ocean and standing in the ocean. The photograph can be beautiful, can capture something true about light and water, but it will never be wet. It will never have temperature or taste, or the sense of being held by something larger than yourself. The invisible self, the self that refuses documentation, is the wet self. The self that has temperature and taste and the sense of being continuous with something that can't be captured or shared or liked. This isn't to say there's something superior about refusing visibility. That would just be another form of performance, the performance of refusal, the spiritual materialism of claiming you're too authentic to participate. People who share their lives publicly aren't somehow less real than people who don't. But there is something happening to souls who find they can no longer cooperate with their own objectification, and it's worth understanding what that something is. It's not social anxiety in the clinical sense, though it might manifest with similar symptoms. It's not depression, though it might feel like a kind of death. It's more like what happens to a plant that's been grown entirely in artificial light when it's finally placed in the sun. There's a period of shock, even damage, before it can adjust to this different kind of illumination. The artificial light was more controllable, more predictable, more measurable, but it wasn't nourishing in the same way. The soul that can no longer tolerate visibility isn't failing to adapt to modern conditions. It's recovering the capacity for a kind of experience that requires privacy to exist at all. So what do you do in the meantime? When you feel this revulsion, but also feel disconnected from the world everyone else seems to inhabit. You don't do very much, which is perhaps the hardest instruction to follow. You brush your teeth and eat your meals and go to work and talk to people in person when the opportunity arises. You resist the urge to make this withdrawal into a new identity, something to document and share. You definitely don't post about how you're no longer posting, which would just be performance dressed up in the costume of authenticity. And you watch, you observe what happens in the space that opens up when you're not constantly translating your experience into shareable form. Watch how your attention changes when it's not divided between experience and the documentation of experience. Notice how thoughts become simpler, less performative, less shaped by the awareness of potential audience. See if you can detect the difference between doing something because you want to do it and doing something because of how it might appear if shared. And most importantly, you stop comparing your invisible life with other people's visible lives. You stop measuring your depth against their surfaces, because that's all you can see of them, the surfaces they've chosen to make visible. You stop judging your unfiltered moments against their filtered ones, your private defeats against their public victories, your messy becoming against their polished presentations. Not because comparison is morally wrong, but because it's comparing two completely different categories of experience. It's like comparing the taste of an apple with the photograph of an apple, and despairing that the real apple doesn't have the same saturated colors as the image. The real apple is messier, stranger, less perfect, but it's also the only thing that can actually nourish you. And paradoxically, it's only when you stop trying to make your life visible that you can begin to actually inhabit it. Perhaps the reason visibility feels like violation is that you've outgrown the need for external validation of your existence. Not because you're more evolved or spiritually advanced than others, but because something in you recognizes that the self that can be made visible is not the self that you actually are. It's a translation, a representation, a frozen moment extracted from the fluid process of being alive. And you've lost the ability to believe in translations as if they were the original text. So you're thrown back on something more fundamental and more terrifying. Your own immediate experience of being alive, without the mediation of interpretation by others, without the confirmation that comes from being seen and recognized and liked. Just you, alone with yourself in the devastating simplicity of presence that requires no audience and generates no content and leaves no trace except the fact that you were here, attending to this moment, inhabiting this body, tasting this exact quality of air and light and time. And it's not nothing. It's the garden in afternoon light without the thought of photographing it. It's the conversation that happens in the gap between what you meant to say and what actually came out of your mouth. It's the self that exists before you compose it into shareable form, unfiltered and unedited, and somehow more real because of its refusal to be represented. You didn't lose access to connection or meaning or depth when you stopped making yourself visible. You lost access to the comfortable illusion that visibility and existence are the same thing. And in that loss, there's a kind of terrible freedom. The freedom of being exactly what you are, exactly where you are, without the exhausting labor of translating yourself into something others can consume and evaluate and dismiss. You just forgot for a while that you existed before anyone was watching, and you'll continue to exist whether anyone sees you or not. Walk through that doorway, not by trying to be more visible, but by letting yourself become so invisible that you finally meet yourself in the dark.